Check. 1, 2, check. 1, 2. Hey, and welcome back, guys. This is session number 31 of our exploration of the Gospel of Mark. Look, we're jumping right into chapter number 9 in this session. And this is one of my favorite passages in all of the Gospel of Mark. There's so much historical and cultural meaning in this particular text that I want us to be able to capture and to understand so that we can understand the passage more deeply. And I hope that walking through it together allows us to do just that. So let's go ahead and dive right into our text for this session. Mark 9:2 says, "And after 6 days, Jesus took with him Peter, James, and John, and led them up a high mountain by themselves. And he was transfigured before them." Okay, let's start with this phrase, after 6 days, right? And it should set off some alarms for you. What does this sound like in terms of this 6 days language? If you said Genesis, then you are correct. Remember earlier in Mark, we talked about in the beginning, where Mark talks about the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, how that harkens back to Genesis. Well, here's another connecting point with Genesis where he talks about this time frame after 6 days. Mark only uses a temporal reference to Jesus's activities twice in his gospels. This is one of those times, right? It harkens back to the seventh day of creation, right? Where God does what? He rests, right? It's a day that's very good, right? So after 6 days, Jesus on the seventh day took with him Peter, James, and John and led them up a high mountain. Now, listen, verse number 1 says something very important, right? Jesus talks about them not being able to taste death until they see his kingdom coming. Well, the very next verse, verse number 2, talks about the kingdom of God coming. So he's about to show them the implication of those words. And he does this, Mark does, by referencing back to Genesis, where God rests and where there's this very goodness going on. Jesus is the very epitome of the rest or Sabbath of God. So Jesus is now about to show himself, about to demonstrate himself in all of his glory, right? So where does he take them, right? He takes those 3 special disciples, right? He always has those 3 on these special occasions. We talked about that earlier in one of our sessions, right? And he led them up on a high mountain. Let's talk about this high mountain for a second, right? Before we do that, though, we got to do another thing about this 6 days that I didn't want to forget. God actually spoke to Moses in Exodus 24, and we'll come back to this. It says after 6 days. He spoke with Moses from a mountain. So it kind of connects Moses with Jesus here in this account, and we're going to see why that's important. Now let's talk about this high mountain. He takes him up a high mountain. Now this high mountain actually suggests some kind of proximity to heaven, right? One commentator writes that this account, this high mountain, is actually a suburb of heaven. Think about that. It's right close to heaven. Talking about the significance that this mountain is very, very high. It's so high that it's almost a suburb of heaven. So it makes no mistake that it might be high enough for him to meet with 2 people that we're going to see him meeting with in the next couple of verses. Before we go there, though, we got to look at this word for transfigured. The word there is, I'm out of space here, metamorphao, right? And it means to transfigure, but this is where we get our English word metamorphosis, right? So Jesus here is transfigured, transformed before the disciples' eyes. Verse number 3, and his clothes became radiant, intensely white, as no one on earth could bleach them. Basically, Mark is saying Clorox ain't got nothing on what's happening right now in this text. I can't explain how white, how intensely white Jesus's clothes became, Mark says, right? Now, Daniel 7, if you want to go back and look at that text, talks about the Son of Man and his clothes being white as snow, right? So again, the Son of Man is a messianic title. And Daniel 7:9 says that the Son of Man, who Jesus here is expressing in the glory of the Father, is someone who comes with clothes white as snow. So Mark is definitely making that connection there as well. And there appeared to them Moses and Elijah, or Elijah with Moses, and they were talking with Jesus. Now, Elijah and Moses. What's important about these two figures? Well, Elijah represents, right, the prophets, and Moses represents the law. Together, they represent all of the Old Testament. So all of Old Testament history is standing here with Jesus. And both of these men had to meet Jesus here on this mountain. They're talking with him on this mountain, right? It says that they were talking with Jesus. Now, my obvious question is, hey, what were they talking about? I wish I could eavesdrop on their conversation. Mark doesn't tell us. But this is where looking at other passages helps, right? So if you look at Luke 9:31, it tells us that they were talking about his departure. And that's going to be key here, okay? Because the Greek word for departure is actually exodus. They were talking about his exodus. So the man who wrote Exodus, Moses, is talking to Jesus about his own exodus. What does that mean? Well, Jesus here is a true and better Israel, right? Israel had its own exodus, right? But Jesus has his own exodus. He's the one who is perfectly obedient, unlike the Israelites. And he has led his own people out of darkness through the wilderness of sin and death and into the promised land of redemption. He is the true and better Israel here in this text. So many historical connections with Old Testament Israel in this text, right? And then Peter, our guy, right, stands up and says to Jesus, Rabbi, it is good that we are here. Let us make 3 tents, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. So they said they wanted to make 3 tents, or Peter said that, right? Why 3 tents? Well, Peter thought that he knew what was going on. How did the people of Israel celebrate Passover? Well, they'd have what you call the Festival of Booths, right? And the Festival of Booths was a time where they spent 1 week out in the woods or the wilderness in tents. I couldn't do that, but apparently they could, right? And it was to commemorate the Exodus, right? If you look at Nehemiah, you'll see that happening in Nehemiah 8:14 through 17. Okay? So Peter here is trying to make that connection. Oh, this is it. This is the Festival of Booths. This is where we make tents, and not just any tents. Tents for the man who was the man in the Old Testament, Moses, and the prophet who was the man in the Old Testament, and this great prophet who's come up in the New Testament. So we got 3 great tents that we can put up in this space right now to commemorate this moment, right? These are 3 of the greatest men in Israelite history. Peter had to be getting it right, right? But he missed something, right? Because he just confessed Jesus as the Christ. And now here he is trying to put 3 booths up, equating Moses and Elijah with Jesus. Then look what happens. For he did not know what to say, for they were terrified. Sometimes you just got to close your mouth. when the glory shows up, right? When the Lord shows up, he would have been better off just trying to see what actually unfolds as opposed to actually trying to do something, right? And then a cloud overshadowed them. Again, that cloud shows up. Same cloud happens in Exodus when Moses gets the 10 Commandment, right? And a voice came out of the cloud. This is my beloved son. Listen to him. This is my beloved son, the Lord God speaking from heaven. Now, first, let me make these connections with Moses and Jesus here. If you look at Exodus 24 and chapter 33 and 34, you'll see some of these connections. Moses sins to meet with God, right? His face shines like Jesus's does in this passage. There's, again, I talked about this earlier, there's a reference to Moses' encounter in 24 happening after 6 days. There's a cloud that covers the mountain in Exodus 24:16. And God speaks from the cloud then too. You see all of these connections? Another one, Jesus and Moses take 3 companions with them up the mountain. And both Jesus and Moses has their face transformed. Not only his face, but Jesus also has his clothes transformed. And finally, there's fear that comes over the people who are watching it after the encounter. So you see all of these connections between Jesus and this Old Testament account in Exodus 24 and in chapters 33 and 34. And then this is the second time in Mark's gospel where God speaks from heaven. The first was when, right? In Mark 1, where God actually speaks at Jesus's baptism, and he actually speaks to Jesus directly. He says, "You are my beloved son, in whom I am well pleased," right? So he addresses Jesus here in Mark 1, but then in this text, he actually addresses the disciples, right? He says, "This is my beloved son." Just in case you guys didn't know, I see you're trying to set up tents for all 3 of these people, but this son of mine, this beloved son of mine is special, and I need you to listen to him. I know you've listened to the prophets. I know you've listened to Moses, but all of them point to this person right here standing before you in glory, right? Imagine this moment for Moses, though. The Moses who didn't get to the promised land, but now he's seeing not the promised land, but the promised one. Elijah was caught up in a whirlwind into heaven, right? Now he's getting to meet the Messiah. What a moment for these 2 men to be able to travel to, quote unquote, the suburb of heaven on this mountain and see the Messiah in the flesh, glorified. To see the promised one. Forget the promised land. They were looking directly at the one who was promised in the Old Testament in Genesis 3, where the proto-evangelion is spoken and says there'll be enmity between your seed and his seed, right? And suddenly, looking around, they no longer saw anyone with them but Jesus only. Those 3 words are the most impactful words in this passage for me. That when they got finished looking around, they didn't see Moses. They didn't see these men who are great men of God. They only saw the one who mattered the most, and that is Jesus only. So as we close our time together, the question is, who or what is our Moses or Elijah? The Israelites were looking to these 2 men as great champions of faith. Peter actually looked to put them on the same plane as Jesus in their life. And God had to speak from heaven to say, hey, there's something different about this Jesus. Listen to him. There are things and people in our lives who may take that place as well, where we're building tents right next to Jesus, whether it be our career, whether it be our pastor in our local church, whether it be our finances. There are things where we build tents every single day. It could even be our spouse or our children or our family. And God speaks here in this passage and says, hey, when you look up at the end of the day, you're only going to see Jesus only. He's the one that matters the most, and he's the one that all that other stuff actually stems from. He is the creator. He is the one who the book of Colossians says was the firstborn over all creation, the one to whom all things are held together, even your marriage, your finances, your career. So when you look to build those other tents, this passage reminds us to look to the one when all those other things disappear, like Moses and Elijah did, and see Jesus only. So what is my Moses? What is your Moses? What is your Elijah? Think through that today as we work through this passage. And I hope that this was an encouragement to you. All right, guys, that's been session number 32 of our exploration of the Gospel of Mark. Really enjoying these sessions and thankful for you guys for joining me on them. I just ask that you would continue to work through everything with me. All right, guys, that's session number 31 of our exploration of the Gospel of Mark. Grateful for you guys for joining me and looking forward to next go round. Grace and peace to you. All right, guys, that's been session number 32 of our exploration of the Gospel of Mark. Grateful for you guys joining me. Grace and peace to you all. Hey guys, welcome back. This is session number 32 of our exploration of the Gospel of Mark.